Namaskar. Today's memorial lecture is a humble attempt on the part of the IS University, especially the Department of English, to pay tribute to the memory of a great person who had worked relentlessly towards and achieved so much in realizing the goals of education, Professor N.K. Jain. With education moving into new terrains, we hope to make a conscious effort to carry forward the ideals and values that he lived by, and strongly believe that as an institution, we can draw inspiration and guidance from the rich legacy that he has left behind. We are both delighted and honored to have Professor Arjun Apadurai in our midst, and who has so very graciously acceded to our request to deliver this third Professor N.K. Jain Memorial Lecture. Thank you, sir, and welcome. I also welcome late Professor Jain's family, relatives, friends, and colleagues, and acknowledge the presence of each of his students and colleagues present in the audience today. May I now invite Dr. Ashok Gupta, Honorable Chancellor of the University, for his welcome address.
Namaskar. A warm welcome to you all on the occasion of the third Professor N.K. Jain Memorial Lecture being organized by IS Deemed to University, Jaipur. We are a cosmopolitan and vibrant institution moving into the third decade of nationwide presence as a leading institution of higher education, grooming the next generation of world-ready creative leadership. Today, after the struggles of the past year, as we come full circle once again for this memorial lecture organized to celebrate the life and times of Professor N.K. Jain, we find our way back to the benchmark set by an academician who remained to all those who knew him a fine embodiment of a life well lived. To look back to the days when Professor Jain came to be associated with our university is to remember someone who has driven to excel, to nurture, to guide. As Professor and Dean of the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences, he fulfilled those roles to the best of his prodigious abilities. A scholar at heart and teacher by vocation, he led by his own example, showing students and faculty members alike what learning truly meant. Coming from a strong academic background, he touched many minds with his wide and vast knowledge, exceptional grasp for language and literature, a unique wit and turn of expression, and a very sense and a wry sense of humor with his students and colleagues remember to this day. His stepping into a classroom was met with a sense of excitement and expectation. His students, knowing that they would leave enriched and improved in equal measure, leading his audience in open discourses, he ably encouraged suggestions and innovations with regard to both teaching and research. His journey inspired all who knew him, as evidenced by those who hold fond memories of the person he was. Well liked and deeply respected by friends, relatives, and colleagues alike, Professor Jain is thus remembered as a steadfast pillar of the IS family. Over the years, his erudite scholarship laid the groundwork for the friendships and academic connections that have sustained till date. Many of those people, I'm sure, are in the audience today. I'm happy to welcome you all to the third Professor N.K. Jain Memorial Lecture, which has been organized at the initiative of the university's Department of English, Professor Jain's parent department, to honor the memory of a dear colleague and revered teacher. I extend a special welcome to Mrs. Mithilesh Jain, Professor Jain's wife, and Mrs. Nandita Kasliwal, his daughter, and most importantly to Professor Appadurai, who had joined us from Berlin, Germany, for delivering the memorial lecture. I cannot thank him enough for his gracious consent to deliver this third commemorative lecture. I extend a very hearty welcome to you all and say welcome, welcome, welcome.
Thank you, sir. I'd now like to invite Dr. Rakhi Gupta, Registrar, to formally introduce the distinguished speaker for the day, Professor Arjun Apadurai, before inviting him to deliver the memorial lecture.
Thank you, Remika. Thank you. I hope I'm audible. Yeah. Namaskar, everybody. It is my pleasure to introduce our distinguished speaker for today, Dr. Arjun Apadurai, who will be enlightening us in a few minutes from now on Loneliness, a Brief History. Dr. Appadurai is the Goddard Professor Emeritus in Media, Culture, and Communication at New York University, USA, where he's also a senior fellow at the Institute for Public Knowledge. In addition, he's the Max Weber Global Professor at the Bard Graduate Center, New York, fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and member of the UNESCO Commission on the Futures of Education. Professor Appadurai has been conferred with many fellowships and honors, such as the 2019 R.P. Chanda Medal of the Asiatic Society of India and the 2021 President's Award of the American Anthropological Association for his outstanding contributions to anthropology. A prolific writer, he's renowned for his scholarly publications that have been translated into French, German, Japanese, Spanish, Portuguese, Chinese, and Italian, and include books such as Modernity at Large, Cultural Dimensions of Globalization, Fear of Small Numbers, an essay on the geography of anger, The Future as a Cultural Fact, essays on the global condition, and Banking on Words, the Failure of Language in the Age of Derivative Finance. Professor Appadurai's most recent book, entitled Failure, came out in 2019, and he's currently working on a study of the new political lives of caste in India. He's also the co-editor of Public Culture and serves on the editorial board of Global Perspectives. It is indeed a matter of great honor for me to invite Professor Arjun Apadurai to deliver the third Professor N.K. Jain Memorial Lecture. Welcome, sir, and over to you now. Thank you.
So you'll need to unmute your mic,
I
sir.
need to unmute.
Right.
Oh dear, start again. So
Please
I
do.
begin by thanking all the three of you who have spoken, the registrar, the chancellor, and my friend and colleague Remika Singhvi for creating this opportunity for me to honor a scholar and gentleman who I had the pleasure of meeting in 2011, 10 years ago, when I had the pleasure of visiting your campus. So though I'm far away now in Berlin, and we all are doing things by these new technologies, it's very good that I have, along with my wife, Gavika, a wonderful memory of the 2010 visit to Jaipur and to your university in that context, where I think there was a cultural event that we came to from the conference site. And that was part of our experience of a look at the remarkable dynamism of Jaipur as a city and of universities, including IIS, which were doing so much to enrich scholarly, academic, and professional life in and from Jaipur and in and from Rajasthan. So it was a very important thing. And I'm sure 10 years later, much has happened, but as happens in these periods of time, we also have losses, such as those of Professor Jain. And of course, I'm therefore doubly honored to offer these thoughts on loneliness in his memory and in his honor. So having said those things, let me launch into my lecture, which I hope will be no more than 40 or 45 minutes. And I hope that will leave some time for Q&A, which for me is always the best part of these occasions. But unfortunately, we have to get through the lecture. So I will do my best to make that a relatively painless experience for you. One cautionary remark, because I spent almost half a century in the United States before coming 5 years ago to Berlin, this set of reflections is very much related to my experiences in the US and in Europe. I do indeed have a very active interest in India, past and present. And even today, I'm reeling from the news of what happened in Madhya Pradesh in relation to a film set in which Bobby Deol was performing. So I have India deeply on my mind, but this talk will mostly be about what we may loosely and broadly call the West. But I hope there will be, in the Q&A and elsewhere, occasions to bring up the question of other experiences, other locations, other geographies, notably the Indian one. So, an orienting question about loneliness is whether, like childhood, air conditioning, and cubism, it is a recent or modern invention. At first sight, it appears to go back to at least the Garden of Eden in Western thinking, in which at least one part of the problem was that either Adam or Eve must have been quite lonely, in addition to, however briefly, having been alone. And since man has always been sociable, at least for as long as he has been sapiens, he must have been prone to feeling bad about moments of aloneness, this being a simple definition of the abstract noun loneliness. Thus, loneliness must be as old as our species, with the only difference being its degrees of differences of intensity, the culturally permissible expressions of it, and its classification as a disorder or malady. If this were the end of the matter, all that would be left is an exhaustive and exhausting list of this encyclopedia of its appearances. So let us pursue, therefore, the second option, which is that loneliness has a marked moment when it appears on the human landscape or is invented by someone who felt this hitherto nameless sensation or who observed it in someone else. In other words, let us ask what it means for loneliness to have a history. To make this large bite chewable, let me further state that for an anthropologist, history is always a matter of context, and the most significant contexts are cultural, that is, are specific to language, environment, and cosmology. Thus, all histories are local, even if some are more parochial than others. In the Atlantic West, which, as I said, is the scene mostly of my remarks, the problems of loneliness, of solitude, and of isolation have not been distinguished in the many aphorisms, cliches, and truisms about this topic. Let us consider isolation. This is the situation into which many of us today, including the ill, the elderly, housebound persons, children without access to schools or friends, all are and feel isolated. This is a state usually known to prisoners, especially those considered dangerous and people with special medical needs or symptoms. Now, it is a generalized state for any person living in a country or city where COVID has produced a lockdown regime of some sort. This sort of isolation was historically chosen by various monastic and anti-social religious orders in which men and women chose to isolate themselves from society at large, but they always had each other's company, even if in circumstances of sensory austerity and minimal sociality. But COVID-19 has made chosen or imposed isolation the social norm, the condition of safety and health for many. For those in such circumstances to be social, that is, prudent, risk-averse, informed, considerate, means to cease being sociable. Building on Michel Foucault's insights, we might say that the clinic, the monastery, and the prison have now become the prototypes for ordinary, quotidian social life. And all of us in widely differing social, cultural, and political circumstances have had to make our homes, our buses, our taxis, our offices, our schools, and our playgrounds spaces of deliberate isolation. In these institutions, which Irving Goffman memorably called total, the logic of communication and self-presentation involves a struggle to enact the routines of normal sociality under the conditions of confinement, surveillance, isolation, and stigma. He thought that was true of these total institutions. Now I'm saying we are all in a total institution all the time. Now we see a great reversal, thus, of Foucauldian punishment through isolation and Goffman's total institutions for handling social misfits. Under COVID-19 lockdown conditions, many societies have had to encourage ordinary individuals in the familiar settings of home, pleasure, friendship, and family to recreate the conditions of prison, monastery, and clinic in their own private lives, ideally voluntarily. This has been a major and traumatic experience in which humans, in many places, have had to learn to self-punish, self-isolate, and self-distance in order to salvage the conditions of future social normalcy. The home for many is now the total institution where we administer our own isolation, confinement, and monitoring. In this sense, isolation too has a discernible history in which it has moved out of the shadows of stigma into becoming a primary feature of social functionality. In other words, isolation is another condition for all of us in order to be social at all. Let us then turn to solitude. So isolation I've talked about, now I'm coming to solitude, which is an invention of the Romantic period in the West and carries a much more pleasant set of associations. And this, of course, is a subject I tread on with caution because it's an English department specialty. So please forgive me for any generalities or oversights in this matter. The literary study of solitude in the context of European Romanticism is both crowded and noisy. Most possible changes, or most possible variations have been already rung on Wordsworth, lonely clouds, contemplation, the company of nature, and communication with the birds and bees as the core of the aesthetic experience. In fact, a case could be made that in English Romanticism, nature becomes the great utopia that opposes rural solitude to urban decay, industrial despair, and proletarian misery. This cult of nature, in which its abundance of life was a solution to the problem of solitude, thus keeping true loneliness at bay, was also accompanied by the melancholy of death, loss, and mortality. In this sense, English Romanticism anticipated the new literatures of COVID by connecting solitude, death, and bereavement into a single melancholic frame. The difference is that we no longer have Wordsworth's nature to stage our melancholia. In our age of Silent Spring, Chernobyl, global warming, and viral disease. Hence, solitude has now become a space for nostalgia about nostalgia. So we can't even go to nature and be nostalgic. We have to be nostalgic for those times when we could be nostalgic. It's a kind of fake news. Sorry. And of course, the alchemy, which changes loneliness to solitude by changing one's companions, has much older roots in the West than those of modern Romanticism, it should be noticed. It is a venerable part of Christian thought, at least since Augustine, who was the first Catholic philosopher to say that loneliness converted to solitude is the path to the company of God, the only sure antidote to feeling alone. That is solitude, which is the road to God. This theme has been embroidered by numerous other writers, poets, and preachers in the Catholic tradition before it seeded, it generated its romantic translation into the transcendent joy of clouds, daffodils, and other natural crowds. Today, we have yet another change of landscape into the space of the cloud, capital C, the net, capital N, the web, capital W, and the network, capital N, where loneliness can be rewritten as solitude, this time an electronic sublime. This last transition is something I'll address in my last section after a detour, which I'm about to make, into post-World War II sociology and social life in the US. I want to make a little detour. And this section I call, for reasons some of you recognize, the birth of the lonely crowd. That's what I call this session. So the 20th century is the century of crowds, masses, mobs, and swarms, co-produced in the familiar marriage of sociology and social life, and enabled by the social construction of sociology. Ever since Turney's, Weber, Durkheim, and various lesser fathers of Western sociology pondered and bemoaned the victory of the routinization of mass society over the charms of earlier, more intimate social bonds, humans in the aggregate have been the source of much anxiety. The mass human, or the human mass, have been studied by Gustave Le Bon, Ortega y Gasset, the leaders of the Frankfurt School, such as Adorno and Horkheimer and so on, and many other luminaries of Western social science. The fears of humans becoming machines, of the organic becoming mechanical, of crowds becoming mobs, had a special terror for liberal Democrats, for whom massification was the hidden underbelly of democracy in the age of elections, parties, and the expansion of the right to vote. So somebody like Ortega wrote a book called The Revolt of the Masses, which was the fear that if you really let democracy out of the cage, there would be hell to pay. And in a way, in places like India today or in the US under Trump, which I'm going to talk about in a minute, that's what's happened. The beast is out of control. The idea was a good one, but the beast is out of control. That's what crowds can do. Nazism and its various European and American versions, along with Soviet communism, offered the comfort of suggesting that these terrible forms of collectivization were the results of totalitarianism and not of democracy. Now, almost a century later, Donald Trump, Narendra Modi, Jair Bolsonaro, and many other elected tyrants have ended that illusion, that it only comes from totalitarianism, never from democracy. That is now an illusion we cannot maintain. But the 1950s, especially in the United States, had two sides. One was the utopia of suburban lawns, Reader's Digest, imitative consumerism, Levittown, and the fantasy of the United States as composed of a population of Ozzie and Harriet households with blacks, cities, communists, and aliens from outer space safely outside the realities of ordinary middle-class life. But the dangers of these alien forces were never far away. That is in the American 1950s imagination. And they animated a spate of studies of the dangers of corporate homogenization and Stepford suburbanism for the most cherished ideals of American ideals of individualism, freedom, adventure, and self-creation. So in other words, all these forms of massification were seen as great enemies of the core American values, which were kind of high and extreme even individualism. No book in this group, in this vein, was more important or influential than a book called The Lonely Crowd, 1950 book, David Reisman, a classic of American sociology. He had two other co-authors, Nathan Glazer and Raoul Denny, but Reisman really is seen as the key mind in it. Along with a landmark study of the American middle classes by C. Wright Mills, the great Marxist sociologist, this book, that is The Lonely Crowd, opened the space for important books like the best-selling novel, The Man in the Gray Flannel Suit, Sloan Wilson, 1955, and the path-breaking sociological study by William White, which is crucial in the history of business studies, called The Organization Man, 1956. So you see, 1950 to 1956, you see a whole set of anxieties and debates surrounding crowd and how the crowd itself can produce a form of loneliness as opposed to the magical individualism of which India was, the US was so proud. So the worry was that would go and replacing it would be, quotes, a lonely crowd. People together, but all lonely together, so to speak. Many less forceful books, articles, and opinion pieces in the 1950s and subsequently echoed this train of American noir sociology and laid the grounds for much of the oeuvre of John Updike, for example, exemplified by the series of novels about Harry Rabbit Angstrom, like Rabbit Run, of J.D. Salinger's Holden Caulfield, relentlessly spotting, in his word, phonies, and most recently, Jonathan Franzen's Elegy to Solitude, a book called How to Be Alone. So the point is, this has never gone away from American life, this anxiety that as we become a mass society, a society of crowds, of conformity, our most cherished values is going down the drain, namely that we are all different, we are special, and we can do anything and so on. So this 2002 collection by Jonathan Franzen, very recent, great author, one of the best current living American writers, is a flashback to the romanticism of the 18th century, which I mentioned a little while ago. The enemy of the sublime now being not crowds, but the digitalization of privacy, the publicity of confession, the shrinkage of public space, and the possible death of the novel, all because solitude has shrunk. Again, this is Franzen's view, leaving the lonely crowd without the resources to write real prose or poetry. So Franzen is worried that novels are, the space for writing fiction and poetry is shrinking because of digitalization, etc. So it's a different fear than the 18th century fear, which pitted nature against the city. This is society against digitality, so to speak. Even so, ultra-modern a writer as Don DeLillo, also a very important American writer, was enlisted to allay Franzen's despair and to show him that we must keep up the search for writerly solitude in the age of a shrinking public sphere. So you have someone like Don DeLillo, who's a very, very avant-garde writer, but in this case, you know, giving an avuncular reassurance to Franzen, no worries, we will still find a place for writerly solitude, etc. So something is going on here, interesting. DeLillo, you might say, Don DeLillo, is today's Wordsworth, a measure of how hard we have to run just to stay in place. Yet, while Franzen was mourning the cult of privacy and the shrinkage of the public sphere, a political scientist at Harvard called Robert Putnam, only a few years later, that is later than 2002, was being hailed as the new David Reisman for his work on social capital, loneliness, and the erosion of civil life in America. Reisman's other-oriented Americans, that was a Reisman phrase, that people were not oriented to themselves, but to others. See, this is conformity, all sorts of things which now seem very quaint and long ago, but they were very recent debates. So he was being hailed as the new David Reisman. Reisman's other-oriented Americans who listened only to the bugle call of conformity and had lost touch with their inner individualism were, by the late 1990s, that is 40, 50 years later, seen by Putnam as woefully under-socialized, too lonely for their civic good, inadequate generators of social capital, zombies on a lonely planet. In other words, his book was called Bowling Alone, bowling being one of these strange American sports, but bowling alone is a weird contradiction, because of course when you bowl, it's a social activity, but he saw they were all bowling alone, which was his trope for saying the civic sense is gone. There is no public sphere. So you see there's a kind of odd repetition, 18th century to 1950 to 2000, this is coming back again and again. The other-oriented has begun. The other-oriented, in other words, David Reisman's other-oriented, had begun to bowl alone by 2000. It is not within my scope today to speculate on whether this change over half a century in the United States was due to huge changes in American society, or whether it came from some melancholia, if I may use a literary term, within American social science, especially among its Tocquevillian voices. What is clear is that Americans, at least when they had the leisure to reflect on themselves, did not know the boundary between loneliness and healthy individualism, or between being dressed in gray flannel suit and being civic human beings. That line had become blurred. Some of this ambivalence casts light on the recently ended Trump presidency. And I want to say a few words about this. I have a longish section on Trump, but for reasons of time, I want to compress a little bit. And this section, which I'm going to just summarize, is my reflection written just a few months after the end of his presidency, which feels like it was decades ago, but it's hardly a year. It's very, very recent, which also means, of course, that everything he did and created is very much alive in the US. So the idea that, we are happy days have begun, we live happily ever after, almost anybody who's intelligent in the US knows that's wrong. Joseph Biden is a decent man. He's not a monster, a clown, etc. But the attacks on the most basic principles of American life, the American Constitution, the courts, which Trump inaugurated, there's considerable evidence that they are in play, and that the Republicans are carrying that heritage forward in an even more extreme way than Trump himself. So when I speak of Trump now, it feels like speaking about the past, but actually it's a very active present, and Trump himself has not gone away. So he's still got his eyes on 2024, this, that. But my argument about Trump in relation to today's subject, which is loneliness, has to do with an argument that I make in some detail here, but I won't dwell on each line of it, is that in the story of Trump, we see the end, and this is an argument that many people find shocking or counterfactual, the death of what in the US and worldwide we now call the image. So we say image building, image promotion, PR, advertising, this is just the image, this is Modi's image, the reality is this image, image, image. This all comes from the 1950s in the US. That is when the idea of image is born, along with political propaganda, television. So when Kennedy defeated Nixon in a famous television debate where Nixon looked like he hadn't shaved and Kennedy looked great. That was seen as the inaugurating moment when the image became the dominant currency of politics and indeed of life in general in the US. So there's a huge literature from that time about image building, which almost all of us have read in different versions. In fact, it became a kind of ordinary term in ordinary life, but it was a technical term. And there are excellent technical books from that time which are trying to think about what is image. Now, what I'm arguing is that when you look at Trump, at first glance, his speeches, his rallies, his this, his that, he looks like a monster of image. But what I'm arguing is that actually he is done with image. He signals the death of the image in this American sense. I don't mean image in the world of art or photography. I mean in politics, in advertising, in PR, in media. It's the end of the image. Trump brings us to the end of the image. Now, what do I mean by that? I mean by that Trump didn't care what he did. In front of the camera, outside the camera, near the microphone, he simply did not dress himself up. And that is what his followers loved. They weren't there for a cleaned up image. In other words, please be shaved, please look handsome, please look young, please look honest. See, John F. Kennedy is the great example of this. It was an earlier time, 1960 to 64 or 55 to 64, Kennedy notoriously slept with every woman he could put his hands on, but it was never discussed. It was a different era because his image was kept carefully curated. And everybody, including journalists, including the Secret Service, including Jackie Kennedy, including his brothers, were co-conspirators, as was the general public. Even though they knew little rumors about Marilyn Monroe, there's that, the image was maintained with the same care that would be given to a deity in a Hindu temple. Carefully maintained and dressed up from morning to night. Trump takes that and tears that into 100 pieces. He says, I don't care about my image. I will say what I like. I will do what I like. I will use every swear word. I will abuse colleagues, friends, other politicians in public. I will abuse the press. I mean, but the best is not only he didn't care for image, the most important thing is his followers loved him for that. So what I'm saying is, even though, of course, in a conventional way, in American politics and in American society, and for that matter in India, again, you can look at Modi and say, he is representing an older idea, you see, where the image must be clean. Background mein jo bhi hona hai, hone do. But in the front, you must look like this, like Gandhi, like whatever. Trump tore that script up. And what I argue, and this comes back to loneliness, my general theme here, is that he had transcended the issue of communication versus miscommunication. He was not bothered about that. And his audience, his followers, his movement also did not care. And my argument is foundational to this abandonment of the idea that you must maintain an image, which, by the way, all of us do, right? All of us in ordinary life also have an idea where we may think this, we may feel that, but we don't act it out right in front of everybody. Trump threw that away. His followers loved it. And what I argue is underlying this is actually a contempt, a deep contempt on the part of Trump and his followers for the social itself. Because if you look at Goffman, etc., what is the social? The social is the presentation of self in everyday life. I don't spit at you when I'm saying hello, even if I may want to. The general rule is I don't, I may want to scream at you, but I speak a little softly. And when somebody loses it, they go to prison or they go to a loony bin. They've seen as having lost the fundamental capacity to be social. So socializing children is teaching them exactly that. How do you present yourself? Not what you feel deep in your heart. Of course, There are some traditions in which it's very important to feel like that inside and outside, but most traditions don't bother. They say inside you can feel anything, but please behave yourself. Behave yourself is the building block of social life. That is what the great insight of people like Goffman is. It's not just rules and roles and sociology 101, SNE. It is the very elementary physics of sociality means you have to present a face of some kind, which is credible, plausible, and makes you look like a human being, like a reasonably normal human being. Goffman had great examples that when somebody is walking somewhere on the road and trips on their own shoelace, why do they say sorry? To whom? It's because they're saying it to some abstract viewer who may think they're incompetent or stupid or this or that. They're saying, oh, no, don't worry, I'm in charge here. Okay. So my point about Trump and all is they produce a deep indifference to the social itself. So it's a radical form of mobilizing people on the basis of a complete contempt for the social. So you see, there's a paradox here. You create a social movement by saying you despise everything social, everything, every norm in American life. So it's a very, and Trump did this. He openly expressed his contempt for all the key American institutions, the judiciary, the legislature, and the free press, as well as for teachers, military persons, scientists. There's nobody he didn't abuse and badmouth. Your question was, who's left? Who's your planet? Who's your polity? Well, that's a very good question. But the good news is in India, this is not yet open. So our leaders in Delhi don't openly say, oh, Parliament is a bunch of racketeers. Court is in our pocket. They don't openly say this. Now, our leader in Uttar Pradesh is coming close. That's why he's setting the bar high for all the others. But Trump went miles ahead. So let me now come to my last brief section, which is some reflections on the world of the digital in relation to loneliness. And here, again, there are some very sharp differences of opinion among scholars of the digital world, whether in the US or in India or elsewhere, about whether it creates potentials for essentially for new kinds of ties, new kinds of connectivity, new kinds of collectivity, new kinds of social movement, Arab Spring and so on, or in spite of the appearance of all those things, actually it makes us part of a lonely crowd. It actually makes us unable to appreciate true, genuine, historically created sociality. So my friend and colleague Sherry Turkle has a great book from 2011 called Alone Together. The title tells you right on. So see the echo also of Lonely Crowd from 1950, David Reisman. So here's Sherry Turkle 2011, Alone Together, but trying to talk of computers, digitalization, so on, with a real worry that it bypasses many kinds of ordinary sociality. Now, I agree with this, and most of us can see. When you see 5 friends going to a restaurant and all looking at the iPhone, we know what it means to be alone together or by yourself together. I actually think there is a deeper issue, and that's what I want to end with, which is that more than the fact that digital communication, connectivity, solidarity produces a shrinkage of the space of body-to-body intimacy, friendship, memory, pleasure, there's something bigger, which is that all these digital affordances, especially the world of apps, Uber, this thing, that thing, of which now, especially in the US, we have 10,000. You have an app for taking a bath, you have an app for, there's nothing for which there's no app. That, to me, is actually turning our historical sociality into a raw material. So it's no longer about mining coal, mining mine, mining steel. That's all going on, of course. They don't end. But mining the social, finding out how you and I want to connect, so that we can turn it into an app, so that we would use the app. So it's sociality itself has become an exploitable resource. That's my real worry. And that means that in our time, that process is itself the biggest potential threat to, let's say, solitude as a positive experience, and threatens to actually multiply loneliness in its most engineered sense. It's going to multiply because the social has become itself a raw material for digitality. In that process, loneliness becomes, has the potential of becoming the only game in town, because there is no other kind of more pleasurable aloneness. It just, you're just lonely, or you're in the crowd that's digitally connected. Let me stop there and thank you all for your patience. I haven't followed the clock. I hope I'm sort of okay. It's not bad. Okay, great. Thank you very much to Rimika, to all our distinguished colleagues, and to all of you in the audience for your patience. And I'm now open to some back and forth.
Excellent. Thank you so much, San. Of course, this is only the talk part of it, because you did say that you want to keep the main meat in terms of keeping aside time for question answers, both from students, colleagues, academicians, etc., because that also sort of determines exactly where you have taken us to, which actually has been pretty expository. You have indeed shown us as to how the experience of isolation and the attendant existential angst, if I may quote from what you really shared with me some time back, they have dramatically affected our need for both coming together and socially distancing ourselves, again, to be alone together. And thanks to the explosion in social media, it has made sure that we stay in our little cocoons and still continue to want to socialize. So given these circumstances, I think your talk has been both topical and extremely timely in addressing our own preoccupations with the question as to how do we understand the meaning of loneliness today, which has changed radically, as you have very well sort of shown. The floor, of course, is now open to Q&A. Questions,
I hope, may I just ask
yes.
Rimika, if anyone
Yes,
who speaks, sometimes I can see the face, sometimes I cannot say who they are.
Right. So I'm going to, request
and then
everyone.
I can take 2 or 3 questions at a time, maybe, rather than which will give chance for more people to
absolutely, sir, absolutely.
Whatever you like.
Sure. I mean, either way, I think we're very flexible in terms of taking questions, queries. If they can turn on their videos, it'll be excellent, because then there's that kind of almost personal touch virtually.
Yes,
and if
yes.
And if not, of course, they type in the chat box and I may read them out for you for your convenience. So either way, you can raise your hand or just unmute, introduce yourself and get started. Anyone, I have some hands raised already. We go to Angad. Mr. Angad, quickly introduce yourself, please, and shoot.
Hello, sir. Good afternoon. And I must say it's an honor to actually be able to listen to you, and thank you so much for having this lecture. But my question is, when you said that we are becoming more digital and people actually starting to mind the very concept of social itself. See, if we take it in the context of a post-humanist planet, that the identity of being a human itself is being converted into what is essentially ones and zeros, which is the binary language of digital computers. So if we see this, and if we don't stick to the dogmatic view of physical manifestation of human identity, and if we simply say that human beings, especially after COVID, are simply turning into information, into digital information, isn't that less lonely and more of a gregarious view of post-humanist human identity? Isn't that less lonely and more together in a sort of way which is holistic? Because I can actually talk to someone who is halfway across the world from me, connect with them, and also put myself in a way in which would not have been physically possible. For example, I can't change my body, or I can't change my body in a very short time, but I can change my information that I put forth on the digital platform, and how I am turning myself into information, into ones and zeros. I am essentially turning my human identity into ones and zeros. So isn't that quite the opposite of loneliness? A post-humanist planet, which is essentially more human because it is more gregarious than was earlier possible. So isn't this essentially the opposite of loneliness?
So maybe, Rebecca, I will respond because this is a sizable
Yes,
question.
yes.
And a very good one. So I thank you for it. The fact that we are having this conversation is already a tribute. I have a little joke at the end of my paper, which I dropped because I was talking more orally, that everybody now wants a Zoom of their own, not a room of their own, but we all want Zoom of our own. So, so I thought let me introduce that joke that way. To say that Zoom, I've been observing, enables all kinds of things, obviously in the last year, such as this kind of event, which would take a huge, production and would then be full of uncertainties, logistical issues, so on and so forth. Now, at some point, that's also going to create a bandwidth problem, because if you have 20,000 Zoom conferences a day, how many can I go to, So we know there are problems, but it's still very enabling. I think the point you're making is a deep one, which is to say, in some of my own work, I engage quite considerably with the new relationships that have been identified between humans and other forms of life, of which machinic life is one, but also organic life, insects, animals, germs. So along with Latour and another 100 people, there's this huge move, which is what you're flagging, towards not putting humans in a separate and privileged box, and then everything else is different, but to say life itself. Vital energy has many forms, from small things to, and that machines are very complicatedly related to humans, and that humans have become partly mixed up with machines. All this I actually believe. The question is, where does it take us, and what are its logical conclusions? And I'll tell you only one thing, because this is a very massive set of issues and debates about post-humanism, ethics, politics. For example, if we become all more like machines, then what's the politics about? Is it going to be a democracy of all living forms? Who will control it? And so on. So hundreds of problems. But one thing I see, taking your own example, that if you can more easily convert yourself to information, which then connects to other people through infrastructures and so on, isn't that generally a good thing? Well, I would say in one way it's a good thing, but in another way it's very troubling, because I've written elsewhere to say that our digital selves are almost always highly partial. So it's me when I'm dating, it's me when I'm doing this, it's me when I'm investing, it's me when I'm studying, it's me. There are 10,000 me's. Now, and secondly, that partial set of what I call individuals, which are not individuals, but individual chopped up pieces, each of them I have a different score. I have a different credit score, I have a different employability score, I have a different, rental score, I have a different car buying score, and of course in India there is Aadhaar, which is now connected to every other score, from PIN number to PAN code and this and that. So that is a very, not only is it highly chopped up, so we can say, where is the self? Self is now in the blender already, chopped up nicely, the vegetable cutter. But also the people doing the cutting are not us. You're not the one deciding which is your financial self and which is your healthy self, etc. So my concern is that all this connectivity comes at a cost, which is that we are chopped up and divided, often against our will, and we can only connect one part of me to one part of you. Is that an ideal sociality? Now, it's an open question, but I would say that's the doubt that I want to raise. I'll stop there.
Right, sir. We now go to Dr. Heather, followed by Dr. T. Ravichandran, and there was also Dr. V.K. Shrotriya in that order. And of course, there are chats that are popping up in the chat box there, but I guess the raised hands first, because we can then go over to the chat box. Dr. Syed Heather.
You can also take a
please.
cluster this time, and I'll try and pick a few things.
Right, sir. While I figure out a very long chat, whether it's a question or a comment. Yes, Syed, please go ahead.
Thank you. I just wanted to actually pick up on Angad's point. So my name is Syed Haider. I'm from Royal Holloway here in the UK. I wanted to ask to sort of pick up this idea of loneliness, isolation, and solitude. And I wanted to ask that if we go back to Augustine, for example, there's something about meaning within solitude. And I suppose you could use or think of God as a kind of category by which meaning is being processed or meaning is being sort of drawn out. Is part of the problem that we suffer from in an age of loneliness a problem of meaning sort of making, and how do we sort of perhaps link a loss of meaning or a proliferation of meaning? So the fragmentation that you were talking about the self, I think has some bearings on this. And ultimately, I think there's something to be said about the social contract. The social contract reduces sort of physical pain insofar as it creates the circumstances for reduction of conflict, etc. So could there be a breaking down of the social contract, which is also therefore driving this sort of excessive move towards loneliness? So just picking up a couple of strands from your talk. Thank you.
Rimika, shall we also add some other things so that more people can get their voices
okay,
in?
so can
or should I respond? Yeah.
Either way, sir, may I just check with Dr. T. Ravichandran if his query is attendant to what Syed has asked, then maybe, or is it very different from?
Alag to hai, doesn't matter. It can be a la carte, you know.
Okay. So in that case, Dr. T. Ravichandran, could you just let us on to exactly what you want to ask? You need to unmute your mic, sir. Dr. Ravichandran, please unmute your mic, sir. Yes, sir.
Yeah, am I audible?
Yes, you are now. Yes.
Okay, okay. Thank you, sir, so much for your very insightful thought on loneliness and touching upon the COVID pandemic issues. So one thing struck me, and I just want you to throw more insights on that. So human beings, are they essentially loners, or whatever is said as man being a social animal, man is gregarious by nature, is that a social construct? So this became very acute when people like Robert Frost would say that home is a place where when you go, they take you in. And this time when particularly the migrant community, student community, and like lots of people, when they went back home, they didn't want to stay at home. And like the existential point of view, taking Sartre's quote, hell became others, including family members. Some of the students I knew committed suicide, could not tolerate the conflicts at home, and they all wanted to run away from home given a chance once the lockdown was released. So this was like a paradox, and I'm not able to resolve it. I'm just eager to hear your insights. Why, how, and why home has become a place where we come to become gregarious and establish our familial identity. How could people, individuals, feel alone at home? How have we become unhinged at our own home? So thank you, sir.
Thank you. Rimika, should I respond, or do you want to add one more?
I think maybe we could just listen to what Dr. V.K. Shrotriya has to say, because he's raised his hand for quite some time now. Dr. Shrotriya, please.
Hello.
It's yes,
hello.
yes.
Yeah. So
Please
I'm
go
his
ahead.
daughter. I couldn't connect it with my own device. So I'm Akshada. I'm doing my
All
MA
right.
from Delhi University. Yeah.
Sure. Welcome.
So
Yeah.
what I wanted to ask was, first of all, thank you so much for your enlightening talk. So it was really nice listening to you. What I wanted to ask was, when you were talking of Romanticism and the 18th century English literature, I was also thinking of the relationship between classes and isolation as well as solitude in the context of India at present, because if we look at COVID and how the impact of it has been, we also see that a lot of people have the privilege of of imposing that isolation on themselves in the Foucauldian sense, as you also talked of. But at the same time, there are also people who do not have that privilege, and hence isolation or self-imposed isolation rather becomes a task for them. So if we are to look at isolation and the idea of solitude, because solitude is also something that's a luxury. It's an intellectual luxury if you really think about it. So how do we place that and situate it within the context of that, of class issues, that is?
So perhaps I should respond, Rimika, if that's.
Yes, sir. I think so. So in the meantime, I'm just bunching the chats together for you to
very
comment
good,
on.
because otherwise,
Yes,
I
yes.
will, my brain has only three is my maximum bandwidth.
Compartments.
So I go backwards from Dr. Shrotriya, I think was the question, last one. Then Professor
Ravichandran, yes, sir.
And then Mr. Haidar or Professor Haidar, perhaps, I don't know. So, yes, you might say isolation is usually imposed, and therefore it, in a case like COVID in India, it is to some extent a function of the power of the state or the municipality or the police or somebody, and that can be relatively even. In other words, if the state says nobody can go out after a certain hour, more or less people of all classes have to comply, although of course we know in India there are escape hatches for people who are highly privileged, but that's isolation. Solitude is a different matter. And you're absolutely right that solitude requires, solitude is a pleasurable experience of being alone, which is chosen and which you can afford to do. And we know that probably 80 or 90% of the Indian population cannot afford that. So even the middle classes, let's say people working in bureaucracies or teachers, professors, typically cannot simply say, we want time for ourselves, so to speak. That's very, very hard to do. And you really have to have a tremendous amount of privilege to be able to say solitude is your primary need, or you need solitude today or this week or this month. It's a little bit like leisure, or vacations or going to, Singapore for 10 days. That's not available to the large bulk of the population. So I totally agree with you that in this sense, solitude is very much a luxury. It's different from loneliness, which is unfortunately freely available. In other words, anybody can feel desperately lonely, even if they are working in, butchering chickens in Bhendi Bazaar in Bombay. They can be lonely because their lives are leading them to feel a lack of connection. That, alas, is something nobody escapes. And for the poor, it's a double burden because you're also reading otherwise brutalized life, plus you're feeling lonely. So lonely is different from solitude. Solitude is indeed a privileged experience, as it was in the Romantic period. And for those poets, I mean, after all, Wordsworth could go to the Lake District, but there are other people sitting in London who couldn't say, let's go for 2 weeks to the Lake District. And then you can multiply that by 1,000 cases, or when later Byron goes traveling in his Bildungsroman throughout Europe, how many people could go from England throughout Europe? So in general, you're absolutely right, but I think that's another reason to distinguish loneliness from solitude is that these things have different degrees of class privileged markings about them. Quickly then, I'll leave it there just to, in the interest of time, go on to Professor Ravindra Chandran's question, or is it Ravi Chandran? Please correct me. Professor Ravi Chandran.
Ravi Chandran, yes.
And we have spoken before in a similar medium, I recall. So thank you. I would say this, that my view, maybe because I'm a social scientist, is to stress that man is a social being, as we often say in the cliches of introductory sociology. Because if that were not so, at least half my business would go. I'd only be left with 50% of my current business. So that is a little prejudice, but I do believe it, even when, as you say, people are shattered or startled. And there are two experiences here. One is people who come back, let's say after some travel, some external journey, migrant workers, students, etc., and find they are totally alienated in their family homes. The other is where the family says, who the hell are you? See, that goes also the other way. Now, and the mother and father, instead of, telling the boy how wonderful it is, will be asking 100 things. Why didn't you make more money? You didn't send this, I complained. So I know this all firsthand, that it can go both ways, that the delights of reunion are often compromised by, all sorts of things. But going to your side of the question, I would still say it's social, but what is happening for young men and women who have this experience when they're returning home, to be very specific, from somewhere, and maybe in the Middle East, maybe in the US, maybe in Delhi, coming back to Tirunelveli, for example, they can, I think what happens, and the sad thing is that when this happens in an extreme way, it can produce psychological breakdown or suicide. But in the more routine way also, we can say that they are missing one social and are in the prison of another social. That is, it's not that they're against the social. It's that they miss certain kinds of egalitarian friendship, freedom to walk around, roaming, safar karna, ghumna firna. That suddenly, mommy is saying, kahan ja rahe ho, what are you doing? This, that. It is a kind of sense of claustrophobia. So it's not always so, but I'm saying it's always one social is battling with the other social. It's not that the loner is battling, but loner is also there, but it's a very specialized phenomenon. And you will recall that in the 50s and 60s, there was a lot of literature about alienation, outsider. There was a book by a guy called Colin Wilson, very popular when I was in college, The Outsider, from Britain. It's a book that not even 4 people remember now, and probably for good reasons, but outsider meant that kind of person. So that's a special type. But I would say generally, people have a struggle between different modes of sociality, the one they want, the one they've discovered, the one they seek, and the one they feel imprisoned by or habituated to or forced into. So that's my quick response to your very important question. Finally, Syed Haider, excellent question. I'm with you that there is some kind of crisis of the social contract. The question is how to think expansively about the social contract, not merely as a legal political doctrine, of a certain period which governs market relations and law and so on, but more capaciously. Arrangements and agreements, more, let's say, in the spirit of Marcel Mauss, that there's a kind of binding relation. So I think of social contract that way, and that is definitely fraying. But like the nation state, the fraying began the day of its birth. In other words, it's not that we have 100 years of happy social contract and everybody's living joyously together and one day it begins to fray. It's like ridden with contradictions from the start, and those intensify. And I see that we're seeing a phase of intensification. So that part I'm fully with. I think it needs to be, specified in various ways, but you know that, of course. The part that I think I have some disagreement with you on Augustine or even other senses is the meaning making. Because I'm all for that. Again, in anthropology, we know that's almost our primary business, is asking, how in different cultures meaning is made. This is a Geertzian move. It's what is in all our DNA. We are drilled, hammered with this, that this is about Meaning, but not meaning in general. For us, it's always meaning here, meaning there, meaning in New Guinea, meaning in Hampstead. That goes without saying. The trouble with the meaning-making approach, whether it's to Augustine or anybody, or the limitation, I won't say the trouble, is that it leaves out the whole set of words which we have learned to take very seriously in the last, let's say, decade or two, which is affect, compassion, feeling, warmth, sensory togetherness. Meaning making has, in that context, a slightly scholastic or abstract sound. Now, for anthropologists, it's easy to say, because we are in this business for a long time, to say, well, it's all connected. So meaning is also the same as, ritual process and this and that. It's not all written texts and all that. But in the West, I think we have to be careful, because meaning making could lead us to a abstract or even technical sense of what it takes to stick together. Whereas a lot of the glue of sociality is affect. Of course, the challenge is affect, feeling kindness, compassion, etc., are not just shapeless, bundles of stuff. They themselves have a shape, a design, an architecture, but they are different, I would say, than what meaning making is to me, which is not merely legal in a sense, or contractual, as you say, but it's also deeply linguistic. And there are non-linguistic processes that go on between us. So I'm with the line of your inquiry, but have a slight difference in maybe how I think of those terms.
Right. Thank you, sir. I believe Professor Mukesh Williams also had raised his hand. Somehow I missed it, but then in the meantime, he typed his query in the chat box. So Professor Williams, would you rather ask that question in person, or do you want me to quickly read out your query? Professor Mukesh Williams?
Have to unmute me. Yes,
yes sir, right away.
Yes, thank you very much for this wonderful opportunity to listen to Arjunji, and having read when I was young his book, Modernity at Large. So thank you very much. I have a question for you, which I have also loaded there, that I think that I give you my conclusion before I ask you my question. So it's easy to understand.
Yeah.
My point is that if loneliness gives power of whatever kind, it is manageable and welcome. This is the main point I understood, and I think you would agree, because you have also pointed out this fact. The point I want to make based on this: once modernity created a sense of freedom in city spaces, which you have very rightly put, but the inability to handle it. Today, digital technology has created a sense of freedom that we can handle. Your take on that, based on the conclusion that I have made.
Yeah, thanks a lot. I hope I will, in giving some reaction, I would say, rather than answer or conclusion, understand and reflect a correct understanding of the way you're thinking. I think I have an idea. And the brief way I'd put it is, yes, the freedoms that the digital gives us, for example, to seek connections with people very far away, that's clear freedom. Now, I'm not locked into my 5 friends in my building or in my college. I can go here, I can go there. It is also true, what you say, that these digital freedoms are manageable in the sense that we can also select our friends, narrow or widen our circles, conversations. There's a good deal of that capacity. The catch is, as always in these things, and that's why there is a dilemma, is what's the price? That is, we could say, I have a big income, but what is the tax? So the tax is 80%, I'm left with 20, not good, though it's still freedom. And the tax, I think, comes in various forms. One is the very well-known fact that extremely large machineries of states, of corporations, and of various blends of the two, the latest being Pegasus, are defining the entire stage on which we think we are being free. So is that freedom when every prop and every move is created by Google, Facebook, this, and plus secret dark organizations, the dark net, this one, that one, fishing for this, fishing for that. So I worry that our freedoms, several of them, or many of them, or in many regards, are more apparent than real because there's a lot of rigging of the game going on at a very high level. If one is neutral, one would also could just say, forget all those conspiracies, privacy, Edgar Snowden, this one, that one, and say, the platforms are being engineered at a grand level. So yes, we are free, but it's like we're jumping around on somebody's platform, So there's that problem. The other one, of course, is the converse of that, which is what I alluded to in a previous point, that we are also being chopped up or divided up into various dimensions of ourselves that are more or less interesting to Facebook or to Google or to the social sites, the ones that young people use, which are very popular, or TikTok or whatever, that we are always at risk of becoming more available than we wish to be. And usually not knowing when that is happening. Because if somebody in ordinary urban social life is misusing you, you generally know if they are trafficking you, if they're exploiting you in labor. But here, the scary thing is you don't know. But there is enough information to say it's happening. So my short answer is yes, freedoms which are managed well, as opposed to overindulged, are certainly a positive thing. But in this case, the question is how much of the management of our freedoms are we ourselves doing? And how much is being done for us, as it were, already outsourced without our permission? So somewhere there is where I would take the debate or question, but I think it's a very important one and I appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Right, so thank you very much. We do have a few pertinent questions, queries in the chat box as well. So if you allow me, I'll just sort of bunch two together. There's
Sure.
one by Professor Lajwanti from Baroda, and her question revolves around the aspect of democracy in terms of the crowd and the individual, the we and identity, wherein the spheres of the social public are divided from the spheres of the private, which is the space of loneliness that you dwelled on. So that's something I think she probably wants you to comment on. And should I take another one, sir, or would you want to first?
No, I think I need to understand these two better. Lajwanti Chatwani is a friend.
Right. In fact,
I just want to understand. I think we met even in Jaipur also.
Absolutely. In fact, yes. And if she's online, then maybe. Excellent. Yeah.
Because, I need to know her question. If you can just restate what.
Yes, because we just tried to paraphrase it to the best of her abilities. But if she's here, Lajwanti, would you want to just unmute and go for it?
Thank you, Ronita.
Yes,
you,
she's here. Right.
Thank you, Arjun, for that wonderful talk. Nice seeing you a long time. My question, I'll be very quick. My question is, how would you read the relationship between loneliness and of the crowd or of the individual, whichever, with the emptiness of the idea of democracy? Now, let me clarify. And the emptiness, you would know, is the fact that the idea of democracy is based on the concept of we, a political concept, we or the people, which is supposed to be empty of any identity. Once you fill it up with an identity which binds the people, it's no longer a democratic concept. And I think that's what we're seeing in India now, that there is a filling up of the emptiness of democracy. So how do you read that emptiness of democracy and the concept of loneliness? Because I should be lonely in the democratic space and not get into a connect with other people in order to lose sense of that. And the second question, another quick one, if you can take it, is do you see this is a shift in terms of the idea of the public, which was once upon a time the everyday life, the life of social, and the private as a space of loneliness by choice? Today we see the opposite with social distancing and, if you like, the mask. The public has become the space of silence, a space where you're not supposed to be social, while the private has become the everyday social life, if you like, social quote unquote life. Thank you very much for a wonderful lecture, Arjun.
Thank you, Rajwanti. It's good to see you as live as we can be in these platforms, but still better than by email or otherwise. Great questions, actually. And the radical part of your first question is, if you turned it into a normative statement for a moment, and not a question even, we could say, without loneliness, there is no democracy, which is a beautiful, completely counterintuitive, and also in a way cuts the ground out from the line from Arendt to Bonnie Honig, we the people and all that. All that begins to wobble if you say, be very careful with that we-ness, because you don't really want that. Because democracy requires some abstraction from specific, shall we say, commitments on the basis of likeness, say identity and so on. I mean, the catch with that fascinating idea that you need aloneness is it's a little like a kind of extreme or dark, which is why I find it interesting, version of a kind of Rawlsian position. The veil, the burqa has come again, but in a more extreme form, saying, look, any form of, let's say, fleshly connectivity is not a good idea. You really need, so that I see an echo of the most interesting part of Rawls there. But I think it's well worth considering. I think my own take on that is that the road to the capture of the democratic idea by, let's say, Hindutva, for example, but it could be Trump, it could be Erdogan, it could be, we know all the usual list of suspects, so to speak. But in India, in my view, which I've touched on here and there in my writings, but you give me a new chance to state it properly, is that because the national idea for me is fundamentally an ethnic idea, which is to say an identity idea. So if you do the math of it, for me, it means the nation state model is the primary enemy of the democratic model, because the nation state model already says it's us, our democracy. Our means some stuff is coming in there, which is, it then quickly becomes Hindu, majoritarian, blah, 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 Pak, pure, this, that. So in a very strict way, you could say the condition of loneliness as the possibility for democracy requires no nation states, worldwide, then it'll work. So a minute you say, no, and many people will say rightly, who will manage the whole world? Where will the courts be? So let's make it smaller, chota sa territory mein kare. And answer then is ethnic aa jayega. There is no other way, because Indians will say we are not Pakistanis, Pakistanis say they're not Bangladeshis. We know the road. So I think there are some, what Kant would call antinomies here, but I think your point is right, that what we think of as identity issues are at fundamental odds with the formal requirements of what we think of as democracy, but what to do? Because either we make nation state completely undemocratic, then everything works. Say, yeah, we are like that, this is our country, we do it our way, authoritarianism, nationalism, everything goes nicely together. But if you want democracy to be abstract and only, it becomes very abstract. Nobody wants it. It's like Habermas's constitutional sovereignty, It's like, nobody finds it attractive, So there's a deep dilemma here is all I'm going to say. And I'll quickly make a comment on the public-private, that just to say, I totally agree with you. There are a lot of uncanny reversals going on. And some of those reversals are actual reversals. In other cases, I think they are implosions of public regimes into private spaces. So what you had to do somewhere in a bazaar, now you have to do in your next bedroom. You know, you have to keep some distance, do this, do that. So it's a kind of folding in. On the other hand, the other side is also there, that things that you only did at home now, you know, can be broadcast because of digital means. Is that, you know, the selfie, that there's so there are some odd reversals as well as implosion, explosion going on, but it's a fascinating thing, and its implication, which I'm sure you're already thinking about, is that all the classic theories that we have, both about the public sphere, Habermasian, etc., and civil society, John Keane and company, all of them have to be started again. You have to start from A, B, C, D, which is, of course, a headache, but I think it's unavoidable. There, I'm totally with you. So thanks for both these wonderful questions. Great to see you.
Thank you so much. Can we go over to a few students, because I do see one of our own students, unless Divya Sharma also is a student. I'm afraid I don't recognize her by just her name, but Keyushi definitely is. So maybe Divya Sharma, and then Keyushi, do you want to unmute your mic and then ask the question straight away?
Yes, ma'am. Thank you so much for inviting me. And so this was a great lecture, given the fact that I'm sitting in the confines of my office listening to you right now, is an example enough to whatever you are telling. That, you know, this modern age has brought a lot upon our plates. And my question is, what precedent do you think we are setting for the generations to come? Because we know that you and I and people before me have seen the world, have been outside, but the kids who are, you know, still 5 or 10 and are still developing, don't have a critical idea about the world and its ongoings, politically and personally. How do you think this whole concept of loneliness and being alone in a crowd defines their lifestyles?
Thank you. Maybe I just respond briefly, or Rimika, do you want me to hear the other question?
I think we can just take Divya's also, sir, so that at least, you know, one has looked at these two questions, which were, I think, burning in there.
Divya just asked the question.
Actually, yeah, I called out Divya's name, but Keyushi spoke.
Oh,
so,
okay. Sorry,
yes,
that's my
yes.
small confusion here.
No, I was confused for about 30 seconds too.
So should we take the other one?
I think so. Divya's already here. I think she's brimming with her question. Go for it, Divya. Yes.
Hello, sir. Hi. It's a great honor to listen to you and to ask you a question. I've been a big fan. So my question is this: we've sort of.
Where are you based?
I'm based in Chennai, and I'm doing my PhD from IIT Kanpur.
Okay.
So we see loneliness as becoming a sort of human condition in the contemporary times, especially, and with paintings and popular media, loneliness is sort of inculcated even within the movies that we watch. So my question is that for many people, loneliness is sort of an aesthetic relief. However, there are people, especially subalterns, for whom loneliness is sort of imposed upon them.
Yeah.
So don't you think that by actually celebrating loneliness or terming it as a human condition, you're sort of overwriting the struggles of people on whom loneliness is sort of imposed? So how do you sort of reconcile with such a predicament?
So maybe I respond to your question first, and then to our other colleague's question later, whose first name I couldn't properly catch, but I'll ask her in a minute. When I responded to one of the earlier questions, I was trying to touch on the same thing, namely privilege. Who gets to have what experience? Who is allowed to have what experience by choice or as luxury? I think one of our colleagues put it. And who has no choice, so to speak, about how they feel or what they experience. So here I would simply say loneliness is that kind of luxury or privilege. Oh, sorry, solitude. Solitude is that romantic experience which we can seek. I wouldn't call that loneliness. I would say it's a kind of aestheticized experience of loneliness is solitude. But you can experience loneliness from any class or any position. And isolation, of course, can be heavily imposed, especially on those who are not protected, therefore who are marginal, subaltern, and so on. So I think one has to be a little careful of these terms, but I certainly would agree that solitude is a privileged category, whether it takes an aesthetic direction or takes some, let's say, ascetic direction. You know, how many people can just afford to take off to the Himalayas and so on. So that is definitely a class-ridden affair. But I do fear that loneliness is a bit more widely spread and seems to accompany all kinds of class positions and so on, where people just feel, you know, ill understood, alienated, whatever that. And especially if you bring in the idea of alienation, mostly it's workers, you know. So you can say rich people don't necessarily always get pressed to alienation, but if you're on a factory floor, you know, turning out 500 pieces of something a day, alienation can come, and following that can be loneliness or isolation, more precisely even. So that's the way I would differentiate, but I think that is the way I would approach the question of which parts of this complex of things are tied up with privilege directly, and which parts seem to be more widespread parts of our current human condition. So I'll leave that there. And then I go to the other question about the next generation. Very, very challenging question. I'm just at the end of a 2-year process of serving on a UNESCO commission, I think that was mentioned by one of our distinguished colleagues who introduced me, having to do with the futures, plural, of education, not the future, but the futures. And that report is about to be launched. It's a massive, like 150-page report, into which a number of people contributed, including myself. It was mainly about where are we going? You know, so it was exactly your question, directed to younger people, younger students, and to the next generation of humanity. What do we mean by education? What should we value? Also with the digital, what should we keep? What should we take? What should we emphasize? What should we avoid? So I'm giving this as a small promotional statement about that report, which when it appears, I hope many of you will read, because it's really relevant to all of us. But it bears on the question about the next generation. And I would say it's always the challenge of generations, even before digitality and all, that when one generation succeeds another, there's a tendency to treat the circumstances of their lives and biographies and environments as permanent or absolute. And they forget that there was another generation which had a very different experience, whether of wealth or war or anything else. And that only comes through education, because socialization is trying to teach you, as you were saying before, how to present yourself in social life. And that has to be present-based. Nobody can teach you how to present yourself as if you were in, you know, Rajasthan in the 14th century. That's very hard to do. You can only do it for today. Even parents can only do it for today. So education, whether at the university level where you are, or high school level, or even earlier, is the place where a sense of the changeability of things and the arbitrariness of things, that is, that in one century, in one place, it can be like this, and this is anthropology at its heart. But education is the only way you can do that. And that, for me, actually is the biggest threat of various totalitarian efforts to control curriculum, this, that. It's not just that they're anti-minoritarian, authoritarian, even fascist. It is that they tend to take away the sense of the complexity of generational succession, historical change, and pick one or two big dramas, you know, and say, that's it. That's all you need to know about history. But what we need to know about history is much more fine-grained, especially about the generation previous to our own. So we don't need to learn about, you know, Harappa in great detail. It's not crucial. Or if I may come closer to Rajasthan, we don't need to know every detail of Padmavati. But we do need to know what was the history of Jaipur in 1902. That is the education that seems to be very important, because it's nearby. It's not creating a fantasy scape of, you know, Rani of Jhansi and, you know, Alwar and this and that. That Nobody's going to take, that's fun for kids, that's not going to be taken seriously. But if you say, look, in 1930, 1940, 1950, there were these communities in and around you here and in other places like Rajasthan, that I think creates a certain distance from your immediate environment, which otherwise all of us have the temptation of taking it for granted, thinking this is the way things always are. Everybody's got an iPhone, everybody's doing this, everybody's doing that. And for much poorer people, to go to the subaltern question, that everybody has to continue to be a Dalit. Everybody has to continue to go and clean up somebody's toilets. It's the same. The world is unchangeable and unchanged because I grew up in it. That has to be loosened up for people to get a critical distance and to make change. Because in many parts of the world, but certainly in India, we know we have far too many things that have remained impervious to progress of some type. So for that, you need critical distance. Anyway, let me stop there. I think we have exceeded, Rimika, my time budget, no?
Not at all. So in fact, I mean, I don't know how you thought that you were to finish all of it by 3. Your talk was to finish at 3, and then we would have opened up the forum for questions. But I'm glad you did when you did, because see, I mean, the kind of questions that have flown in, and which is exactly, a huge marker of, what such activities are aimed at achieving. So yes, we have a good half an hour still, I think, or more, depending on how you're placed in your morning.
I think in about 25 minutes,
yes,
I will turn into a pumpkin.
Okay.
All
right. Okay. So my time starts now, and I'm going back to some previous chats, which I didn't miss, but then I was also looking at raised hands, especially students' queries, which are extremely important in such a forum. So let me go quickly to Professor Sharmishta Panjas. In fact, if she's right here, why don't we have Sharmishta ma'am, if you're here, because we'd love to have you ask him as to why, if you call Modi a tyrant, is there no difference between him and Trump? Is exactly what Professor Panja wants to know. But if you can unmute your mic, ma'am, and maybe turn on your video, it'll be that much better. Unless I think she is here, but so that's her question, sir. And if I can just quickly also pass on some compliments, etc., that are part of the chat saved messages. So Professor K.C. Baral, Dr. Monica Jain, Professor Reema Huja, they have written congratulatory messages. Professor Huja, in fact, reminisces about 35 years back at her time in Cambridge, where she perhaps met you and was sort of taken in by your scholarship. So she writes that in the chat box. And Professor M. Sridhar also has something to ask vis-a-vis the digital age, solitude vis-a-vis the digital age. So if he's here as well, Professor Sridhar, would you rather ask that question yourself? I mean, by sort of turning on your video, maybe unmuting the mic. He is here. I mean, of course, nobody's left really. So Professor Sridhar, yes, he is. Professor Sridhar, yes. Maybe centrally, if we can unmute him. So Professor M. Sridhar from Hyderabad. Or we could go over to Professor Sharmishta Panja, formerly with Delhi University. But that's pretty much what they're asking, sir. So Professor Sridhar is saying that in the present digital era, is it possible at all to practice solitude? I mean, that's the long and short of it. Yeah.
Well, I think it is because the population to which that question applies has 2 parts. One is people for whom solitude is a privilege anyway, because they are in situations of labor or so on, which are subaltern situations where solitude is hard, digital or not, and digital is not there that much. But if the people who are in the middle classes and above, who are saturated in digitality, I'm assuming the question there is relevant. Is there room for solitude? And my answer is yes, but it requires a kind of deliberate act of will. It's what we know, many of us, that we have to turn off our devices. We have to get away from the wireless networks. We have to somehow seek distance, and that's a laborious thing. I mean, because these platforms and infrastructures are not meant to let us go. They're meant to catch us and hold our attention and habituate us. So we feel like we're dying if we're not checking, email or Facebook or TikTok or whatever it might be. So I would say, yes, it's possible for those who already have the privilege of being immersed in the digital. It is possible, but it takes a very deliberate effort, usually hard to do as an individual, but as a small group, you can just exit for a while. That kind of thing is possible, but I don't think it's possible in the manner that you could seek solitude, say in the 18th century or somewhere, where you could really exit. That kind of exit, I don't think is possible anymore for the class that has the privilege. For the people who don't, of course, the question doesn't even arise because solitude is not available to them because of the conditions of their reproduction. That is my response to the question on that question. But the other one you mentioned was, there was another one?
Modi versus Trump, sir.
Yeah. So are they the same? Well, I tried to say, this is a difficult thing because a lot of people are writing these days, rightly so, I think, about the global swing to the right, that there's a general trend, Brazil, USA, Turkey, India, Philippines, and already building on China, Russia, and so on. It's really a lot of places, and in Europe, Hungary, Poland, there's just a very noteworthy swing to the right, swing towards authoritarian rule, a swing towards getting away from democracy. And I myself wrote an essay very soon after Trump came to power, not when he was leaving, but when he came to power 4 or 5 years ago, called Democracy Fatigue. And I meant to identify a syndrome where people are just fed up. Say, I want my results now. No waiting, no deliberation, parliament, all this, forget it. Anybody who says, I'll give it to you tomorrow, tends to get a vote. Of course, there are other things having to do with the victories of these right-wing authoritarian figures, but one of them is that many people are fed up with waiting for this, waiting for that. And democracy, in my mind, this goes a little bit to Lajwanti's point, is not only about being alone, but it's also about waiting. You have to wait all the time. It's about patience. And if you lose that, then democracy goes out of the window. But so it's a global trend, but again, being a historically oriented anthropologist, my question is, what's the difference? Then is Erdogan the same as Modi, who's the same as Xi Jinping, who's the same as Trump? It seems wrong. Because they converge in a certain way, it doesn't mean they are generated in the same petri dish or that they respond to the same constituencies or to the same needs. These vary. So just to take one example on Modi and Trump, very important to me is both have permitted and even encouraged cultures of tremendous violence, street level violence against all kinds of people, dissenters of every kind, blacks, minorities, women, students. The list is very long. Can we still say that even leaving aside, is Modi the same as Trump, or practically speaking, close to identical, which I think the answer is no. Even their violence that they permit is not quite the same. Because in India, like everything else, I think the forces of majoritarianism, whether directed against Muslims and other religious minorities or against lower castes, Dalits and so on, and by extension, women and other supporters of these minorities, is always, in a way, fighting against the deep realization on the parts of many groups that they are actually being exploited all the time. So the question is, how, if you take these guys recently, just yesterday, who attacked Bobby Deol's film set, They are street level BJP guys. They're not privileged. Well, were they having a good life? No. So something has happened which draws them into an answer to their own difficulties, which are age-old in India, of poorer people, small-town people, unemployed students, disenfranchised workers, these, or the extreme cases where Hindu tribals attack Muslims or attack Christians. And these are all cases which are counterintuitive, shouldn't happen. In the US, you see, it's slightly different. You don't really have the same sense that everybody perpetrating this violence is or many are at the short end of the stick, are suffering economically. When you looked at the attack on the Capitol last year, almost a year ago, that was not full of poor people, On the contrary, all people who had some resources somewhere, had jobs, some of them police force, retired from the army, This is a very different picture, I would say, than in India. And I'll just add one more comment about Modi and Trump, which is that I touched on this before. Modi cares about his image. I mean, he thinks, of course, he does a lot of things which are not very effective, especially for the educated Anglophone upper middle classes. They look ridiculous. You're sitting in a cave, you're growing your beard and so on. But for clearly millions of people, it's not ridiculous. And he grooms it. Trump did no grooming. So that's a huge event. Trump is like just a kind of guy who enacts the wild anti-normative desires of his constituency. In the case of Modi, what he does is present himself as the trustee of very cherished Indian things, in the interest of which you can then go wild and behave like, thugs. But the thing you're protecting is part of the core of what he presents as the idea of India. Trump had no such core, with all slogans, phrases, very empty character, and his whole history. So if you look at Modi's history in the RSS and so on, it's a very disciplined history coming into the present, getting more and more extreme. Trump is just a mediocre rich kid, It's a much more puzzling story. Anyway, more could be said, but I do not think either that the danger to liberal democracy or to the leaders themselves are the same in the two situations, though very broadly, they are all part of a global trend away from liberal democracy towards various kinds of authoritarianism.
Right, sir. Thank you very much. I don't know, it's a pity they both are not here, but we'll certainly share the recording because your response has been extremely fairly expansive in terms of addressing both the queries. Sridhar sir has 2 attendant queries also, but then I think that's luxury considering that we need to also look at this this one query which was posted quite some time back. Dr. Yash, he wants to take you back to exactly how we have looked at celebrating religious festivals and the whole Foucauldian view of understanding, the idea of disciplining the body. And in the wake of the pandemic, wherein we have lost the social to biopower and digital algorithms, he says, I feel I have realized the value of the presentation of self and performing certain conventions. So how would you respond to that? I mean, it's not really a question, but he's asking for your comments on the presentation of self and performing certain conventions, such as very specifically religious festivals, etc.
Well, what this question opens up to me, or this observation opens up to me, is that in India, let's say the presentation of self in everyday life, unlike in a place like the US, which is more or less one body at a time. In India, it's always, there's a kind of collective element, and the ritual processional element involves very often multiple bodies. And of course, we know in the case of the Prayag and all that, that it's tens of millions. So it can go from tens and hundreds to tens of millions, but there's a tendency for ritual performances in India to be massively collective, number one. And number two, there is a kind of this, it's hard to deny that whether it's Muslim ideology and religion, Islam, or whether it's Hinduism, there's a kind of indifference to the question of bodily health, disease, epidemiology. It's just not dominating not because people are stupid and don't get sick, but because they have other commitments which are more important. So in Muharram, you do certain things and you're not going to stop unless you're absolutely forced, unless you're locked in home, you're not going to stop. Same with Hindu things, same with other groups, but primarily Hindus and Muslims, because Parsis, Christians, others really don't have this huge public mass body-driven celebration. So I guess my reaction is simply that that's a whole area of its own, which is in India, given the centrality of the body to various ritual performances, but also to the very structure of prejudice and discrimination against Dalits. It has to do with smell, sight, sound, and there's a whole now exciting body of work which has emerged in the area of touch, smell, sound, which is casting new light, I would say, on the way these sensory processes are absolutely central to the way people are kept apart. So on the one hand, people are coming together. On the other hand, India is a kind of lab of sensory techniques to keep all sorts of people apart, to keep lowers apart from uppers, to keep Muslims apart from Hindus, to keep women apart from men, to keep menstruating women apart from the rest of the household, to keep this one apart. It's, you might, in a way, you can look at living Indian society and see it as an endless chain of separations, dynamic separations, where the whole fear is that something will mix, which should not mix. That's on the one hand. On the other hand, crowds everywhere, on trains, on buses, on festivals, on this. So you can imagine the tension structurally, leaving aside BJP, Modi, this, that, the tension between, you have to be together with everybody all the time, plus you must keep things separate all the time. Wow. Very demanding, filled with contradictions and tensions. Anyway, I leave it there.
Right, sir. Again, a lot of congratulatory messages from Dr. Manju, Dr. Ved Prakash, Dr. Neeta Kothari, Dr. Ila Gupta, who seem to resonate with a lot of that has been explained so clearly in the wake of, this forced isolation that we were under, the lockdown regime and so on and so forth. There's one more from Ms. Priyanka Sharma, and she wants you to very interestingly comment on, let me just get to the chats. Gastro-political encounters and prospects in the times of the pandemic, especially as we're unable to get together, not be able to be a part of some of the most important family-oriented events, of which food is a big part. So that.
Well, yeah, again, for someone with my interests, anthropological interests, but also some interest in the topic of food, on which I've written in the past, it is certainly a very huge subject in India, and it's actually not written about much. And that's part of a separate mystery why in anthropology, food is not a bigger field. It is a field. There are some little journals and specialists, but compared to the study of sexuality, gender, and kinship, which go together, which have to do with blood, on which there are 50,000 libraries full of studies, on food, which is as basic to human evolution, human sociality, human survival, you could say there's 1%. So there's a little mystery in that from my point of view. But in India, in other words, there's a lot to be said and done. And I think I'll just make a quick comment in that very large area, which is certainly that part of the reproduction of the family, and this is probably true for families at many levels of the social order, not just wealthy families or upper caste or upper class, but even people of very modest means have a way of using hospitality, food, and so on to establish and maintain and reproduce their social ties, their own sense of status, their own sense of integrity, and so on. Very widespread. And probably there is, I don't know anything about this empirically, nor have I seen much about it. There's probably some sense of frustration, which is not just that you're not seeing people, but that the actual sharing of cooked substances in intimate settings is compromised, is probably producing a lot of frustration, anger, irritation. And of course, we know in India that, at least I gather, that there are many places in which these things have been relaxed. People are out, there are no masks, this, that. People tell me that even in Bombay, it's hard to know that there's COVID going on. So clearly these things come and go, they go up, they go down, regionally, Kerala, Bombay, here, there. So it's hard to be general, but I would say overall, people have certainly had to regulate this. The other side, so the family side is one, but the other side for me is something, as an anthropologist with some interest in food-related practices, is street eating. Huge area. You know, I would say half the Indian population eats something outside all the time. But what are they eating? Who's providing that? Is that allowed during COVID? Is it safe? Is it even less safe than before? So public eating, not even religious, simply functional eating, has to also be taking some hits. You know, how freely people go out to eat the favorite foods in the bazaar or in the town. I don't know, actually. It's an empirical question. Whether in a place like Jaipur, for example, people are still going to their favorite eateries and so on, and people may be masking or semi-masking. Maybe those businesses are thriving. Maybe all that goes on there is good, but maybe not. Or maybe, you know, there are people who are being careful. So all I can do here is ask these questions, because honestly, you have to be there and actually not only be there, but have your eyes open and have an idea of what you're looking for to see what is going on. So I'll leave it there with these very loose observations.
Right, so I think that's it. I think we've covered everyone in terms of queries, comments, by sort of bundling them up together, unless there's somebody who feels that his or her question, or their one pops up. I don't think they're going to let you go that easily. Okay, this one's just a thank you. So Dr. Narendra is thanking you for the, and also everyone for the nice set of questions. Actually, yes, I'd agree. I mean, the questions have been as good in keeping with the stature of the talk. So I'm very glad to give you that audience, Professor Appadurai. I'm very proud of the audience.
My pleasure. My pleasure. Wonderful questions, very wide ranging.
Really, really.
And all opening